Let's have some fun with some Imperial Knights now, and put a whole bunch of Knight moiraxes on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another Warhammer 40k strategy video. Today I thought we'd mess around with an Imperial Knight army list, and particularly play around with a whole load of armiger moiraxes, which I think are a very interesting source of potent ranged firepower for an Imperial Knights army list. Today we're going to do a pure Imperial Knights army, which I admit in competitive play is probably hobbling yourself a little bit. Allies add an absolute ton to an Imperial Knights army, but sometimes it's fun just to play a pure army for the challenge of it. So let's take a look at a list with a whole bunch of armigers around a couple of big knights. So in this list we have a House Tyrannus Lance. Despite having the full choice of options available, I've still wound up going for Tyrannus with this, purely because they have a powerful durability buff that's active against pretty much every foe. I could happily see this list being played as something else, such as Houses Krast, Volker or Raven in particular, but I've chosen to go for Tyrannus because I just really like that flat 6-up feel no pain roll to keep your knights harder to kill on the battlefield. So firstly, the main feature and the main firepower of the list are 7 Knight moiraxes, each armed with twin Volkite Vuglares, although 2 of them have switched out those Vuglares for a Siege Claw with a Rad Cleanser. Overall, they'll be putting out 60 Volkite shots per turn, and I really like the Volkite as it's a general all-purpose weapon, pretty powerful at shredding hordes, and also not too bad at all against taking out tanks either, with those mortal wounds and that flat damage too. They're also in quite a nice place at the moment against all of the Primaris Space Marines that we're seeing everywhere. I would certainly not be liking to run a horde of intercessors against this many damage to weapons. These guys are going to be hanging out at the back of the board, hopefully clogging up our entire deployment zone so that the enemy can't deep strike enemy units from reserve anywhere near our lines, and preventing the whole lot of them from getting tied up in close combat, which would be a bit of a disaster. Their 36-inch range and general purpose damage profile means that they can all hover at a long range and put out a lot of damage on any enemy units that they choose to. I've armed 2 of them with Siege Claws, as they're the least threatening of them at range. They'll probably be ignored by enemy shooting, and if any enemy heavies get too close, then they can provide a massive counter-attack element, because if one of those Siege Claw attacks gets through against a heavy vehicle, then you'll be averaging a 5 damage hit, so they're there to punish the enemy for putting any high value units up the board to take out these moiraxes in close combat. Now let's move on to the big knights. First of all, we have our Warlord, which will be a Crusader with the Inferno Cannon, Avenger Gatling Cannon and Ironstorm Missile Pod. We've included the Ironstorm Missile Pod to give this list a little bit of ignores line of sight firepower, which could be a bit of a hindrance, as we don't want to be pushing up too far with our moiraxes, as we really don't want to be getting the whole lot of them locked in close combat against hordes and things. This guy has the Ion Aegis Warlord trait to make him tougher to kill, as he's going to be a high value target because of his powerful all-purpose weaponry. He's taken the relic, the Helm Dominus, to buff all of the moiraxes in the gunline. I think I'd only keep 2 or 3 of them next to him, but the Helm Dominus will allow him to nominate a target within 24 inches and have all of the armigers get a +1 to hit against that target. So that will keep those Vuglares incredibly accurate and basically provides them with a 25% damage buff if they all focus on one target. I did consider swapping out a Preceptor for this role to give them all reroll 1s to hit as well, but honestly I think I prefer to have the Crusader with its better weapons compared with the Las Impulsor, which is just a little bit lackluster in comparison to the Inferno Cannon and the Avenger Gatling Cannon. I honestly still think that we'll get more value out of that compared with the reroll 1s to hit. Our last choice will be a Knight Warden with an Ironstorm rocket pod, and he'll take the Endless Fury relic. Endless Fury is just a massive flat upgrade on the Avenger Gatling Cannon, and really buffs up its damage output to make it something scary. The Ironstorm is again there for a bit of ignores line of sight firepower, to punish any enemy units that think that they can hide out of line of sight of the massive Vuglair fire that will be coming in at them, and this guy will be used a little bit more aggressively, probably in front of the army, ready to counterattack any hard-hitting enemy unit that thinks it can just march up and try and tag these guys in close combat. We'd certainly be thinking about charging him up the board as a bit of a sacrificial piece, and perhaps if the enemy units are clawing all over him, then detonating him in the middle of the enemy lines with the noble self-sacrifice stratagem. So how would I use this list on the battlefield? Against almost any army with mobility and the ability to charge, the key thing would be trying to keep as many of the moiraxes out of close combat as possible. We'd have to deploy the siege claws, the warden, and potentially even the crusader fairly far forward, so if any enemy unit tries to engage our main gun line, they're in a position to get stomped on very hard with a lot of adamantium feet and hit with a lot of siege claw attacks. We've only got 5 command points in the list, which is a little bit limited, so we really have to pick our moments to use key stratagems, maybe re-rolling a failed charge, perhaps rotating iron shields on the warden if it starts to get focused, and perhaps if we're feeling particularly lavish, then we could use the House Tyrannus stratagem to try and get a knight back up after it's died. That could use up 4 of our 5 command points though, so that will be blowing a lot of our tools for one powerful effect. As the game progresses, we'd be wanting to use the moiraxes to score objectives, and potentially screen for incoming reserves against the main battle line. Having a massive 14-inch movement on all of these guys is certainly very powerful, and should hopefully give us the edge in a manoeuvrability game. I think that it is going to be important, however, that the 2 big knights and the close combat oriented moiraxes do advance towards the later turns, as otherwise we're never going to clear out the main enemy's firebase, even if we do whittle down a bunch of their heavy hitters with the Vuglares. Overall, I think that the main weaknesses of the army list are any army that can deal an excessive amount of anti-tank firepower, particularly Imperial fists are going to be nasty, and armies that have a lot of deep striking, reliable charging melee threat. I think that orcs could be quite nasty. With dajump and reliable charges, they could potentially lock up a lot of our most potent firepower, and will struggle to shift them in melee between the stomp attacks and those siege claws with very limited attacks. On the other hand, I think that we could be quite strong against slow-moving gunline armies. We have the potential to outrange them turn 1 by deploying all of the moiraxes far back, and then using that enormous 14-inch movement to get everyone in range before the enemy has had proper chance to shoot us. And I think that they might be uniquely quite well placed to deal with Space Marines, which are becoming ever more present in the meta as they have all the new tricks from their supplement books. I'm certainly not saying that this is any sort of top tier tournament winning type list, but I think it could certainly give a lot of strong armies a pause if played intelligently. Besides, it's quite interesting to have a look at what we can do with the limitations of just using one army book and trying to get the best out of it. You could definitely make some variations to the list. If you were using allies, you could swap out a couple of moiraxes for maybe a couple of battalions of troops to give us an absolute ton of command points, either with the Admech or Imperial Guard. You could swap in a Knight Preceptor, or you could vary some of the moiraxes' weapons. Say if you prefer lightning locks, we could use a whole bunch of those instead. I think both them and the Vuglares are both pretty powerful, but the lightning locks would certainly be more orientated towards horde slaying. Please let me know if you have any interesting thoughts on how to play a pure knight army. I think that there's an interesting choice between having more board control from having a bunch of armigers about, or just going pure power and maybe taking 3 crusaders to have a whole ton of offensive and melee damage output. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. I'll certainly be covering more of the Forge World Imperial Knights in the next few weeks, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more of that. Again, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.